All right, gentlemen, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it. Between the three of them, they all have a long history, not only here in Jacksonville, but certainly in the political arena as well. All of them having worked in the media industry as well as in politics, and certainly all understanding the effect that one industry has on the other. So that's what we'll be discussing today. I was talking to Mike Miller a few minutes ago and asked him what prompted the topic for today's meeting, not just because it's timely, but what really prompted him to bring this up to the group and pitch it. And he referenced that, growing up, for him, it was pretty obvious when you were watching news coverage which way the media and the reporters that were presenting information to you were leaning. They were either on one side or the other or straight down the middle, and there were really three options for you, Mike. But today, as we all know, there are so many different options out there, far right, far left, and everything in the middle, and it's hard to differentiate between the two. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that today. I'm going to read the bios for our three, and I'll start with Steve. Let me pull that up on my phone real quick. All right, so we actually share similar backgrounds in digital media. Yes. So Steve Patrick is the digital managing editor for WJXT, been there for 22 years, more than that now?
Actually, I retired last November.
Oh, you did? Congratulations.
They brought me back part-time because of the election, so still timely.
Oh, good deal. Okay, wonderful. Well, congratulations on that. Initially created the station's website in 1995 while serving as the news operations manager, and then it became your sole focus when the site was relaunched as newsforjax.com in 2000, so certainly a site that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. The website grew to attract nearly 2 million monthly visitors. Is that number still accurate? Awesome, that's wonderful. And certainly a suite of apps that the news station offers as well. Also, for several years in a row, News4Jax was honored as the station's best media market website by the Florida Associated Press Broadcasters. And it was awarded the Edward R. Murrow Award as the best television news station website in America. I didn't realize that, so congratulations. Thanks for your feedback today. I'll introduce Chris next. So Chris Hand is a Jacksonville native with a long record of public, civic, and legal service. He currently leads Hand Law, a strategic government law firm which helps clients navigate the often complex process of working with city, county, regional, state, and federal governments. When I met Chris, he was serving as chief of staff at the city of Jacksonville. That was from 2011 to 2015. I was a reporter with CBS and Fox then, and we met at that time. You've also been engaged with federal and state government over the years. Personally, you graduated from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs, and you are also a member of the Jacksonville Bar Association, Leadership Jacksonville Class of 2014, an enthusiastic hiker, and get this, he's a dedicated fan of the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Florida Gators. So we'll see how
long suffering on.
We'll see how that goes. We'll see how that goes for you after this weekend. And then quickly, Mr. Tolbert. Certainly not least in this group. Mike Tolbert is an accomplished storyteller and successful corporate and political strategist. He came to Jacksonville in 1969 as a 25-year-old political reporter and quickly got involved in campaign politics. In 1970, he was press aide to a former Florida governor in an unsuccessful campaign for U.S. Senate, then reeled off wins as manager chief strategist for a series of campaigns for Florida governor, Florida cabinet, Florida legislature, Congress, city council, and 4 Jacksonville mayors. In 1979, Mike created Colt Fever, the first shot fired in Godbold's campaign to land an NFL team. And in 1980, he created the Jacksonville Jazz Festival, which attracted over 70,000 celebrants and continues as an annual signature event in Jacksonville, which we all, I'm sure, have attended and appreciate all of your work on that. So thank you, sir. Again, welcome, and thanks for being on the panel today. Mr. Tolbert, we'll start with you. This topic, when we invite...
No, start with Chris.
We can, whichever you prefer.
No, I'm kidding.
When we first contacted you about serving on this panel to talk about elections, what was it that intrigued you, and why did you agree to be here today?
Because Mike Miller asked me.
Gotcha.
I mean, that's very simple. I would do just about anything Mike asked me to do as long as it was not illegal.
Talk about your involvement in media and politics right now.
Right now, it's very limited.
Okay.
I have one candidate running for sheriff, but it's very limited now, which is a good thing, I think.
And what is we're 2 weeks out from the election. What is your impression of what is happening in the world of campaign promotions right now.
Unfortunately, let me go back and answer it in a kind of a different way.
Sure.
Some of these folks I've known in here for 30 or 40 years. They won't admit that, but so much has changed in both the political landscape and the media landscape, and I'm not sure it's always for the best. I sat down at my computer and I made a list of names just off of memory of people that covered politics and government, both in broadcast and for the newspaper since I came to town. Ernie Mastriani, Channel 4 and Channel 12, Bob Vandergrift, Channel 12, Brad Davis, Channel 4, Harry Reagan, Channel 4, Marlene Snyder, Channel 4, Mike Dillon, Times Union and Channel 4, Winston Dean, Channel 12, Mary Ann Christian, Channel 12, Hank Drain, Times Union, Franklin Young, Times Union, Lloyd Brown, Jacksonville Journal, Mike Clark, Jacksonville Journal, Steve Crosby, Times Union, Matt Gallner, Times Union, Ron Littlepage, Times Union, John Daigle, Times Union, David DeCamp, Times Union, and then Mike Miller at WOKV. Back then, it was pretty easy to get attention from the press for something. They were very competitive, always looking for something, which was good for people in my business, trying to find something to feed them. And today, the newsrooms are so decimated, both broadcast and newspaper, that it's really kind of sad. And we don't have enough people watching the hen house, frankly, both in political campaigns and in the government. It's kind of scary, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's changed a great deal.
If you could look back now, would you have changed your approach and your growth in the industry, knowing kind of where the industry is now?
Probably not, because I wasn't smart enough to know how to do that. So probably not. I got very lucky over the years. I had some very good candidates, both good candidates and good people, most generally. Every once in a while you get a bad apple, but not very often.
So before we move on to one of our other speakers, then talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you took in campaign promotions. What would you have been doing at this time?
Well, I'm going to tell you a story that I shouldn't be proud of, and I'm not, but it's about our friend Mike Miller here, who, and this is an example of how much more aggressive the media was years ago than it is today. Mike came to Jacksonville as a bulldog radio guy. And Jake Godbold had decided to run for mayor for a third time. Not because he wanted to be mayor again, but he didn't want Tommy Hazouri to be mayor. And so he got in the race as a way to stop Tommy. At that time, John Delaney was not in the race. John got in late. If Jake had known that John was going to get in, he probably never would have run. Once Jake got by Tommy and it was just John and Jake tended not to show up a lot. He didn't show up at functions. He didn't show up much at debates. He just kind of checked out because he liked John a lot. And so one of those people who started getting on his butt was Mike Miller on his radio show all the time about Jake, being gone, not being there, not showing up. And I got pretty tired of it. And so I called the station one afternoon and I said, I want to go on the air with Mike Miller in the morning to talk about this. So I got on with Mike, and I'm sorry, I was a smart ass from the get-go, and I kept referring to him as Mark, and he'd say, no, my name is Mike, and I said, okay, Mark, and I'd say, now, how long have you been in Jacksonville? What do you really know about this town? Anyhow, my mistake was, while it was probably entertaining to the listeners, my mistake was I was on from 8 to 8:30, and Mike had 8:30 to 9 to crush me, and which is what he did. So, anyhow, what's your next question?
No, thank you for your story, sir. We'll we'll transition to Chris for just a few minutes, if that's okay. Chris, talk about when you were with the city. This was really a time of transition for social media, I think, right? How did that impact your position there? and in politics in that position.
Well, first of all, Amanda, thank you for moderating, and thank you for your current public service,
Thank
the work you're doing now. I just wanted to, first of all, thank everybody for inviting me today. The reason I came today is when Ken called and told me that the other panelists were going to be Tilbert and Steve. Couldn't say no to that. Mike, I've known for so long. Although, Mike, I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed in your answers because this organization is supposed to be about news, and you've broken no news. We already knew that Mike was a dogged radio reporter. We already knew you were a smartass. So there's been no new ground broken here today. So try to break some news. But it's just, and also just want to acknowledge again, there are a number of people here I worked with at the city, in other words, including Amanda, but also want to acknowledge my really good friends Harry and Rita Reagan, who I've literally known my entire life, which has been very short. So that hasn't been very long. But have known them since birth, and frankly, one of the reasons I've always been very interested in media is because of Harry's example. I sort of grew up on Harry Reagan's editorials at WJXT. As a result, it's very satisfying now that the outlet that I'm associated with and spending time at is WJXT. But to get to your question, Amanda, and I think we were both in places, you in TV news and me at the city, where there really was a social media revolution going on. When we got to the city in July of 2011, I think the city, the mayor, the mayor's account at that point, we had a Twitter account, we had other social media accounts, but they really weren't the primary way we communicated. We did that in the traditional ways, having press conferences, sending out emails, the mayor making appearances on different, whether it's stations or interviewing with reporters. By the end of that term, 4 years later, I would say social media had become one of, if not the dominant way that we communicated because it offered that opportunity for direct communication. That's not to say that we didn't continue to use all those other channels, but we had a person in our public affairs office who ended up being in the city for a number of years, James Croft, who's now at Fidelity Information Systems, who really revolutionized the city's social media platform and is really sort of the parent of everything the city ended up doing in that regard. So, we of course complimented James a lot on how he was able to grow that, but it was fascinating to watch it from his perspective and to see that sort of direct form of communication really become a primary way that we communicated as a city. And of course now so many political candidates utilize that, other sort of actors in the political and governmental spaces. I mean, I think it really does help us think through what is kind of media going to look like in future years when there is that opportunity for direct communication. You certainly gain some empowerment in that process. You gain more opportunity for people to, have their own kind of messaging and their own communications, and to even produce shows. One of the things I do in this space is I now host these Twitter spaces with some regularity. I've got one tonight with Matt Dixon of Politico and Nate Monroe of the Times Union, if anyone's interested. But that's a way that we can essentially produce a show without needing all of the infrastructure of traditional media. So it's that balance that's going to be interesting to watch. Now, the downside of that, of course, is there are not some of the same filters that traditionally I think the news media has applied. So really finding ways to strike that balance is going to be interesting to watch how that develops in the future.
One of the challenges that I've faced as a public affairs officer is that everyone considers themselves a member of the media now, and trying to differentiate between them and who we do communicate with directly when we're taking that information out there. What do you have guidance for people in my position and others who are working in this space?
Well, I think there has to be just sort of an overall recognition, obviously, that we live in a very different world now, and that there's, at least from my perspective, there is a place for each of these different types of communication. And I know we'll get into this more today. I think there's a particular role that traditional media can play in this landscape and what they're able to do in terms of gathering information. My sort of personal view is that I'd love to see the traditional media do something that Steve has sort of pioneered at WJXT, which is really kind of finding ways to bring citizens kind of back into the process more, but also recognize out there that there are not only journalists who are active in the social media space, but a variety of, as you say, sort of people who would view themselves as members of the media, and trying to figure out how you navigate who are folks who are really going to help sort of magnify whatever our particular message is, who are folks who are going to, be a management challenge in the sense that no matter how much time you spend communicating there, you're never going to, find the sort of constructive working relationship that might be difficult to do. So I think it's just one of those situations where it's so dynamic and so ever-changing. Being on top of those trends and that evolution is going to be crucial for all of us who are navigating that space.
I'm going to take that to pass it on to Steve then, because you were on top of that as you developed the website for WJXT. First of all, let me back up, though, your reason for wanting to be here and discuss this topic with us today.
Well, twofold. One is politics has been, and in your introduction you said I've been on both sides. Well, actually, I've always been on the media side, but I've always loved politics. One of the reasons I was attracted to politics is growing up in the teenage years, watching election coverage and political conventions and debates and all that stuff. That was really what motivated me to get into the media. So that sort of led to the last 40 plus years of my life. But also now, having worked on the media side, it's a good segue that both of you have set up here, because Mike was talking about how the newsrooms have been decimated and how we can't do what we used to do, and that is all very true. Newspapers fell first. They're still struggling, and we still need to support them. But then television newsrooms, they still are relatively large and robust, but they're serving so many different audiences now, and so much more programming. When I got to Channel 4, they did a half hour at 6, a half hour at 11, and 2 5-minute cut-ins in the morning show, and that was it. And we had a staff of 25 people. Well, now we have a staff of, I bet there's 75 people. But they do 8.5 hours of programming every day. So there is no more depth. In fact, there's a lot more just recycling and almost a factory mentality. And I'm speaking about Channel 4, which I'm prejudiced, of course, and I guess Chris is too, but I think it's the class act of the media, of broadcast media in Jacksonville right now. I challenge anybody else to do better, and I hope everybody is working on that. But it's difficult to do the in-depth bulldog reporting there used to be. There's a couple of old school reporters that are still have the sources and are still trying to do that, but too often management is saying, well, we need you to do 2 stories today, and you don't have time to do that much work to turn that story. If you can't guarantee it's going to be on the air today, you can't do it. And that's just the reality of a local news right now. And touching on something else you said, Amanda, is about how the media has changed, and there's more partisan outlets, and can you tell the difference? In some cases you can. I don't know that everybody is a savvy consumer enough to do that. I don't think that's as much of a problem in local news, at least the mainstream local news. I would ask anybody in the room to challenge this, but I don't think there's a blatant partisanship of the mainstream local media outlets. It's just time constraints and the efficiency they have to work under, and the time limitations of the information they can provide. It's also a factor of social media, which evolved over the course. It didn't exist in your early career, Mike, and then it started in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and now it is the dominant way people get information. And it is depressing to work in a news organization when you see a study that shows that 80% of consumers get their news, not their information, not their friend updates, their news from social media. Mostly Facebook, but also Twitter and whatever. And that touches on something else Chris said, is that it's a direct communication. You understand why politicians and celebrities and everybody else, business people, want to communicate that way, because it is unfiltered. You say whatever you want, you're not challenged. Okay, well, people make comments and whatever, but far more people see the original post than the people that follow up with questioning a fact or whatever. Also touching on your disinformation that you were talking about. It it runs rampant, and it may even be a comment on a legitimate news site or a legitimate politician site, but it's the comment that some uninformed or conspiratorial commenter put on there, and that's what gets repeated over and over and over again in this echo chamber, and that's what we're battling. So that's great that people can talk directly to the audience without having, back in the day, you had to have a rally or a face-to-face meeting for you to hear from the candidate. Well, now you hear from the candidate anytime he wants to, type a few characters on his tablet or appear in front of his webcam. But it's unfiltered, as you mentioned, and many times, and you don't see it that much with local candidates, although there was an example of that yesterday, but with some state and national candidates, they don't meet one-on-one. It's very rare that they have a one-on-one conversation with a reporter or even a news conference. There was Trump, and I'm not disparaging his presidency, but he almost never, until coronavirus came, he was not holding news conferences. He went months and months without holding a news conference. And he even cut back on daily briefings. So the media was left to sources. And that also splintered the information we could provide, because unnamed sources is kind of where we are today with national news. Not, again, so much local. But all of these things have challenged giving impartial information to citizens, which are voters, and that's bringing us back to an election.
I agree. One of the things that I have tried to focus on, and especially because the markets in Florida are so varied in terms of their size, and that brings a lot of varied experience. And in a market like this, we have quite a bit of turnover, and I don't mean turnover, but I mean just growth as reporters move on in their careers. As we prepare reporters to cover candidates and to hold them accountable and to ask these questions, are media outlets doing enough to prepare them to hold candidates accountable or to ask questions on behalf of their audiences?
Well, because I'm holding the microphone, I'll go first. I'd say no. And I think a perfect example of that is the last couple debates. This is probably a more politically savvy audience than most, but we had a gubernatorial debate a couple nights ago. We had a senatorial debate the previous week, and it's disturbing to me to see politicians are really good at not answering the question they're asked. They spin it with whatever they want to say. They're going to work into the answer no matter what the question is, and the media lets them get away with it. And I wish that they would get to the point where, I know they'd blow their whole window of time, but if they would just keep asking the question until they answer it.
Okay.
I think it's a great question. I think the answer is no, but I don't know that that's always, it's something the outlets I think need to do more of, but not necessarily their fault, in the sense that, as you say, Amanda, there is a lot of turnover. Steve is right. I'm not objective. I really admire and proud to be part of some of the content that WJXT puts out, and has be part of that effort. But I think one of the advantages that a station like WJXT has, if you add up the combined amount of time that their entire anchor team has spent in this market, combined, probably just if you take Tom Wills, Mary Bear, and Kent Justice alone, combined, they've got almost 100 years of experience in this market.
That's probably short.
Yeah, or more. You add the rest of the anchor team, you've probably increased that by another close to 50 years. The advantages, and you add someone like Jim Piggott, who, in addition to, having the privilege to work with a man who was out of the city, I worked with Jim daily because his only job, was to cover City Hall. That invests journalists in the community in a way that I think is far more the exception.
Unfortunately, though, Chris, and I don't mean to challenge you on that, but a lot of stations don't have that luxury, right? So
absolutely. That's sort of where I was going. That part of that's just sort of the nature of the market.
Sure.
But I think that is one of the challenges. You tend to have, as you mentioned, I think the word turnover happens so much that you don't always get reporters who are sort of invested in the community as much as those who are there longer. And as a result of that, and that's again, no fault of theirs, it's not blaming anybody, but I think you do have a little less, because there's a little less investment in the community, there's a little less investment in the particular campaigns, and that may affect some of the accountability issues. I think there's some ways to account for that. One, I think there's an obligation on the part of the media outlets to make sure that when they have reporters coming in and they're covering either government or politics, they give them every resource possible to make sure that they have the foundation, the knowledge, the context necessary to do their job. Every reporter I've worked with here in town has always seemed to me very hardworking, very interested in actually getting the story right, but don't always have those resources and context and foundation to be able to sort of do their job, I think, as well as they would like to. And I think that's important on the media outlets. By the way, it's not just the responsibility of the media outlets. I think I've always felt, and I've been doing communications back to when I worked for Senator Bob Graham in Washington as his press secretary, this is a two-way street. And it's not just the job of the media outlets to help kind of educate their reporters. It's the job of the people they're covering, whether that's people in government, whether that's people in politics, to recognize that that is a two-way street of a relationship, and that they need to help sort of educate and provide information and have a dialogue back and forth. You know, one of the things that still pains me today is when I open up a story of any kind, whether that's a broadcast web story or whether that's a story in Jacksonville.com or in any print or digital publication, or whether that's a broadcast story, and I see that a particular government agency declined to respond or had no comment. And that still pains me because that, you know, was certainly never the approach that I've ever tried to take sort of during my kind of time in this, or in organizations I work with, you know, the elected officials or others who were in charge of them. That was not the approach they wanted to take. They wanted to have that active dialogue with the media. So I think the burden is partially on elected officials and others, Amanda, governmental agencies, to make sure that that dialogue is happening, because it helps everybody in that respect. So I think there is that obligation on both people's part. One of the things I do want to mention as to a way I think kind of media needs to kind of maybe shift a little bit in this landscape. And again, Channel 4 is doing this, WJCT, radio is doing this here in town, trying to provide, if we are going to have a situation where citizens and candidates and others are messaging directly, have these unfiltered platforms, at least try to make sure that voters and citizens have access to as much information, as much credible information as they possibly can. One of the aspects of this year's ballot is there are multiple Florida Supreme Court justices and multiple Florida appellate judges who are up for our merit retention process in this state. I happen to follow that very closely because I'm an attorney. But I think for most viewers and voters out there, that is a very arcane and obscure aspect of the ballot. Well, kudos to the Jacksonville kind of media landscape. Both WJXT, through the voter guides that Steve and others work on, and WJCT, Claire Heddles, who's with Jacksonville Today and with WJCT, has put together a really helpful guide on these judges, indicating where they've made decisions, where they haven't. So I think the more that media can do that, note that there are direct channels that empower citizens today, but trying to make sure citizens have accurate information or have places they can go to get accurate information, I think is maybe a vision moving forward for how media can continue to have its very important role in this process.
A couple things you said there I appreciate. I do try to not say no comment if I don't have to, and that's really what prompted my question about education, because we do try to educate on the process in our position, and I think that's very important. I will transition to Mike, though, because I think what you said was very important, that there is some ownership on elected officials and their spokespersons to help address misinformation and disinformation. You agree with that? And can you comment a little bit further? After that, then we'll go to the audience for some questions. If you have any, we'll come out to you.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult for me to follow Chris's intellectual conversation. So, yes, I agree.
More entertaining.
Yes, I agree with that. And one last thing, very simply, I have determined that if you want to have a news conference these days and get reporters there to get a message out, you need to wait until there's a murder. and then call a news conference at the scene of the murder, because that's where they all will be with their cameras. So there.
You think you just need the story, the cell? Yeah.
I have one positive development, specific, I'm sure there's more than one, but one good trend that's happening, and Channel 12 has Verify first, and JXT has Trust Index. I don't know if Action News has something similar.
I'm not familiar.
But they probably do. And then there's a lot of newspaper products, PolitiFact and other things that do the same thing. And is fact-checking on debates, not so much on political commercials, which I think are ripe for fact-checking, because one comes out and says diametrically the opposite of what the other one said, and nobody is going back and telling you, well, what are the actual facts? But we do have some local efforts on a regular basis to fact-check politicians and other claims for the audience, because there are just so many sources of information. You can try to research it on your own, but you don't even know if the source of information you're trying to verify, the other information, is partisan. So that is one positive development in local media.
Wonderful. Any questions from the audience?
There's been a lot of talk about election fraud. Just wanted to get your comments about it, because I covered a lot of elections, and Jim Pickett covers a lot of elections. I always thought it was very serious business. Very serious business. Those people were, they were doing what they had to do. That's what I always thought. I covered many of them. And I know there's all this talk about election fraud now, but, and then people on both sides of the thing in the recent thing said, hey, there was no fraud. And our particular, both sides of the aisle said that ran it. The election supervisors, who I thought were, they did the best they could do. Your comments about that.
I think it's, we've heard over the years that everybody hates Congress, but they like their member of Congress. I've noticed the same thing about election deniers and election fraud, conspiracy theorists. They think they like their local election guy and probably their state elections and how they're run, but they criticize how everybody else is doing it, and they find fault with everybody else. I just find that interesting.
Well, and it just to me is sort of one of the troubling areas of kind of some of the disinformation, Amanda, that you sort of talked about earlier, because I think by any objective measure, for example, the 2020 elections were extremely well run. There were very few incidences of problems, but there is a very large group of people in this country who believe that the 2020 election was stolen, that Joe Biden isn't the rightfully elected president, or there were other offices on the ballot, or candidate X was or was not rightly elected. This is a very concerning development for our democracy, this information. And I think that media, particularly local media, plays an incredibly important role in helping to dispel that. And I don't mean by getting into social media debates with election deniers or others, but I mean by the transparency they demonstrate in the process. In 2020, I was involved in this process less as a member of the media and more in my capacity as an attorney representing a political organization at the Duval County Supervisor of Elections. And people may recall there was some controversy there over a couple of factors. One, the fact that after years of having media and cameras present during the canvassing board process, the Duval County Supervisor of Elections and the canvassing board decided to issue new election rules that would limit the media's involvement in that process and also limit the ability of attorneys or others or other representatives to file election challenges. Nothing brought more sort of media scrutiny on that process than that decision to try and keep the media out. And I worked very closely in that process with people like my friend Ed Burke, who represents WJXT, other folks who were representing some of the other news outlets here in town. And it just left me with such an appreciation of, not that I didn't have it before, but it was a good reminder of the critical role that local media plays in helping to dispel concerns about election fraud or expose it in the event that it was happening. But I think continuing to provide that very dogged coverage of the election counting process to make sure that people, where the Duval County Canvassing Board meets up in One-Imison on the north side of town, they meet in a very small room that might accommodate, particularly during COVID when we were sort of distancing, might accommodate about 20 people total. Well, there's 1 million people who live in this county. And so the role that the news media plays in in making sure that supervisor of elections and other election officials are transparent, particularly the role that broadcast outlets play so that people can actually see in real time these processes happening. I think that is a crucial way to make sure there is continued confidence in that process. And by the way, Mike, I meant to do this earlier, but I forgot to, as we were starting answering questions, acknowledge you because, of course, you were one of the reporters I had the great privilege to work with at WTLV. And as I told Mike earlier, Mike was not just a reporter, but also a self-contained media outlet himself. Reporter, camera, writing, copy, doing it all. So. Yeah, right, exactly, right. So, anyway, Mike? No? Okay.
Yeah, let me ask Mike Tolbert, since he didn't get to answer this one. Pivoting. You brought it up before about politicians not answering questions that are being asked by the reporters. That is a tactic. It's called pivoting. When you're developing a campaign strategy for a candidate, how do you instruct them? How do you teach them how to pivot so that when I ask you what time it is, you end up telling me how to build that clock and never telling me.
No, how pretty that clock is.
Even better. But how does that process work when you're basically educating a candidate that you're working for to let them know that this is the way to not answer the question?
It doesn't always work with the candidate. One of my first candidates would say whatever was on his mind, no matter what, and over and over and over. So it does not always work. I think what you do, Mike, is you do coach these people. What you want to do is give the answer that you want to give. Whatever the question, you do that over and over. So if you want to talk about how pretty the clock is and not what time it is, talk really nice and good about that clock, and divert the question. It's a tactic. It doesn't always work. Unfortunately, though, it works a good bit because there's not a lot of follow-up. Nobody comes behind them and say, wait a minute now. You didn't answer the question. Let's go back. But it's a very real thing.
I have a comment. I'm not in the media. I was married to it. I'm Steve's wife. And I just want to say one of the things about the election right now and concerns of the average citizen, it's crime in the city and things of that nature. And I just want to observe that over the years I've watched Steve in a newsroom interfacing with sheriff's office. That has changed so tremendously as far as transparency, public affairs relations with and communication. Unbelievable. Now they don't even. They used to have police radios in the newsroom 20 years ago. They used to hear what was going on. There's so much going on in this town behind the scenes we'll never hear about. The media will never be able to report because it's so hidden. And I can remember one time when it's about 25 years ago. Back when the PAs did communicate directly with the newsrooms, Steve answered a call when he was on the assignment desk. And there was an APB coming across of a description of somebody fleeing the police in Arlington in a particular car with a particular description. And actually, the person who reported that to the police saw Steve and thought that he looked exactly like the information the police had released on who they were looking for. So he got a call directly from the information officer, and they just had a good laugh. He said, "You're under arrest, Steve. Somebody just reported you. We know where you are." But that doesn't happen anymore. The police do not talk to the media at all, and I think it's abominable. And Jim Pickett's got to go down and pull records and dig and dig and dig to find out what the heck happened. And It's just, that's changed a lot. And it's,
Thank you for your comments.
Yeah.
I think we have one more question from that.
Let's ignore for a moment those that are on the extremes of politics, the people that are on the extreme right and on the extreme left, and that center group of people. Have we lost our credibility with them? Do they respect us as we older ones in this business thought we were respected? And what in the world can we do, short and long term, if you answered that yes, we have lost respectability? What can we do in order to restore that?
I think from my perspective, I mean, I think part of the challenge now is, and it certainly hasn't helped that, and again, as you say, this may be among just certain pockets of the citizenry or the electorate, that there is a, pretty consistent and sustained anti-media message among some now, which is concerning to me because I think it's just such a crucial part of the process. I don't think of it as much of a loss of credibility as I think more that it's just harder and harder to stand out in this increasingly diversified media role. I mean, just think how far we've come from where, people would watch, I'll just use, this as one example, but would watch Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News and, just sort of, take whatever he said as, well, that's, as he finishes up his show every night, that's the way things are, right? And so, or that's the way it is. I mean, he would, I think that has obviously changed, but I think it's partially just because there are so many resources out there now. One of the things I'd love to see traditional media do to make itself, it's already obviously relevant, but to make itself even more relevant is a little bit about what Steve and I were talking about earlier. Look for ways to empower citizens. And I would encourage local media that we've got a great opportunity to do that coming forward. And whether that's one of the broadcast outlets, whether that's Florida Times Union, or other some print or digital outlets out there, or even people who are just active in social media in constructive ways. We've got a really important city election coming up next March and May. Jacksonville's at a real watershed moment. We just commemorated the 200th anniversary of this community. This year is the 55th anniversary of citizens voting to consolidate Jacksonville and Duval County. Next year is the 50th anniversary of consolidation actually taking place. We've entered this new phase in a pandemic. We're hearing a lot about how Jacksonville has this great opportunity and sort of moving forward. There are really crucial issues that this next election will help to decide the fate of. And one of the challenges I hope anyone involved in media will kind of take up as we move into that period is being a resource for citizens, making sure that candidates are forced to address some of these issues and these challenges and set forth what their vision is for the future of Jacksonville, giving citizens the tools so they can do the same thing and make sure that they get their questions answered. But the benefit of this media market is that, it's largely self-contained. I mean, obviously there are multiple counties in this media market, but there's a dominant county, and that's the one we're in right now. I would hope to see every outlet in Jacksonville really make that their mission for the next 6 to 9 months. How do we make sure we get candidates and campaigns to address some of these key issues? How do we give citizens the tools they need to use their effective citizenship skills and do the exact same thing? I think that helps to establish, just in this one market, but, could be done in a broader way, help to kind of cement that relevance for media outlets in this increasingly growing, increasingly changing and evolving media landscape.
Just one thing to add to that, and it goes back to something Mike said about if you really have a candidate that wants to get a lot of attention at a news conference, you go to a crime scene, to a murder scene. I think that's one of the things that the media, especially the broadcast media, is way too focused on crime. It's driving some of the agenda for the political season that we're in, because if you look at crime rates, they're not astronomical. I mean, crime rates in the 80s were far higher than they are now. It's not great, and we don't like to see it, but when we lead more nights than not a newscast with a murder or a threat at a school or whatever. These are not the issues that we as citizens can really take action on. It may motivate us to pick a certain candidate or not, but it's not the community issues that we need to be educating voters and citizens about. And I think it's still going to take a lot to overcome the splintered landscape and the attacks from people who say, the media is, our public enemy number one, whatever. But I personally, I retired officially. I've done some, part-time work on the election in the last few months. But I officially retired in November, and I'm now watching as a citizen. And I tell you, when it comes on, the 6 o'clock news comes on, and I see it lead with a murder or a double shooting, I'm not sure I keep watching. And yeah, if it happens to you in your neighborhood or somebody you know, it's terribly relevant. But I think to most of us, it's just building up a perception of the world that isn't totally true. And we need to be concerned about many deeper issues that we have more control over.
I have a question for you, but I think we had one more. Did you have a question, sir? Yes.
My question is, with a duplicity, do you think some of the credibility has been lost because we don't have the individual stations? Now that we're part of a conglomerate, in other words, we're like a mini network within a network. You got NBC, but then you have, like our station, I think they own 60-some TV stations. So they want quantity and not quality. And like you said, we did the first Good Morning Jacksonville show from 6:30 to 7, and it was scoffed at because who's going to be watching that early? Now we go on at 4:30, right. But how much news can you put in that is relative, especially when you have politics involved, that you don't normally have, and the credibility of the ads that are being, I've never seen such aggressive disparity on the ads that are so negative for the other candidates. They don't want to talk about the issues. They're almost vindictive. So is there any way that you can have them be accountable for some of the viciousness of the ads? Because they're not talking about the issues. They're personal. Like, well, never mind. But do you understand what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I think we all...
We used to cover them.
Right.
I could cover the debates. I was there for a lot of the debates and things that led up to where we are today, and it was completely different. But we weren't on for 8 hours a day doing news either.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot of things we've mentioned here today. I actually said the fact-checking that the local stations are starting to do, and networks do it to a certain extent, and other newspapers are doing it, is a very positive development, but we're not fact-checking the ads, and that's where some of the most vindictive attacks are taking place. That and social media, not necessarily face-to-face in a debate. So yes, they need to do more of that, but there's only so much. It is a advertising supported industry, and there's only so much we can do. If somebody wants to spend money buying a 30-second ad and it's within federal guidelines, legally you cannot turn away political advertising if it has the disclaimer on it, is within the guidelines of the FCC, you have to accept it. So we can't stop the ads, we can fact check them, and I think the whole idea of we don't hold them accountable is absolutely true, but we need to pivot and not let them control the agenda. So if we spend all our time correcting each other, that's not going to be the total solution either. We need to say, here's what people, and this also goes back to what the citizens want, and Mike's comment about the city elections coming up, local elections, we have far more control and impact on. We need to let the citizens drive the agenda. And there are some efforts in that space where we're doing polling, not of candidates, there's way too much of the horse race of who's ahead, but what do people in your community want? What do they want to ask the politicians? What are their agendas? And then that lets us drive that agenda from our audience and not necessarily let the politicians just debate each other on what they think is important, and which turns into lately mostly attacks.
One final question from Gary.
I sometimes find myself wondering if deregulation of broadcasting was such a good idea. Now, I'm going to mention a couple of things that may sound quaint, but equal time, fairness doctrine. Without regulation, I don't think a lot of broadcasters even pay lip service to those kinds of things. What do you think?
I hate to dominate this, but I am the media person here. And going back to your question, sir, about, and it sort of plays into deregulation and duopolies and, one station ownership group having 60 stations. I mean, I had the blessing of working for it is a corporation. They do run 5 television stations, but it's not the massive conglomerate with 20 or 60 stations around the country. There were almost no dictates from corporate of what we had to do locally. And from talking to colleagues at other stations, even in the current media landscape, when there are stations that are owned with, massive numbers of other stations, there's more structure, but I don't see a lot of mandates from above of here's what you cover and here's how you cover it. There's a couple of station groups, fortunately, that aren't in our market that have done that, but I don't see that being a problem. You're right, Harry. Fairness doctrine, equal time is way gone. Even at JXT, they used to offer free time to each candidate for a certain level of office and above, and God knows how many people saw it, but on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, they'd give 2 hours the weekend before an election to everybody getting 10 minutes to say whatever they wanted to on camera, uncensored. And they would group the candidates together. It was kind of like the voter's guide that you now see online, except it was a TV version that everybody had their time to represent whatever they wanted. That hasn't happened in 8 or 10 years. I don't know that that's coming back unless there's a federal mandate. And honestly, we're an advertising-supported business, and nobody was watching those things. So even though there is a civic commitment that a station has to have their broadcast license, the rules are extremely lax, and you're not going to put enough work into that for 200 people out of an audience of 1 million in the city, 1.5 million in the viewing area, whatever it is. It's just they're going to look at return on investment, and unfortunately, it's a business. That doesn't mean that we can't try and we can't do more, and a lot of that's gone online, and there's still some effort to do it. The reason I worked for the station this summer is because they had a commitment to inform the viewers about the political candidates asking for their vote, and they knew they didn't have the resources to do it. They brought me out of retirement to put together a voter's guide this year. I agree with Chris. JCT, I see doing some ambitious efforts for the size of their staff to do impartial, giving impartial information about every person on the ballot as much as possible. And we just need to get more people to pay attention to the fact that the resource is there.
Well, I just wanted to add one quick thing, and I track some of this, Harry, obviously, because I'm a government law attorney. I think what you're driving at is beyond just sort of the legal aspect, but the loss of sense of what is the legal and practical reality, which is that the public owns the airwaves, right? That's who's supposed to own the airwaves in this country. And some of the things that Steve mentioned that have sort of ceased to exist, some of the free time that's given to candidates, those types of things, kind of a retrenchment on debates. There are obviously still stations, even here locally, WJXT and Action News have both, tried to continue to be active in the debate space, but even that's moved back. But my concern is the sort of retrenchment from the sense that the public owns the airwaves. The other factor I'm a little bit that I continue to be worried about is obviously people basically accept at this point that cable news, lines up on one side or the other. Outlet X, Fox News believes this, CNN believes this, MSNBC believes that. That's almost been baked into the consciousness at this point that those outlets have a particular leaning or not. Whether or not it's accurate, that is the perception. I am increasingly concerned as the media media environment continues to evolve about that potentially happening at the local level as well. There was already some discussion of that this year in Florida over the debate negotiations and the gubernatorial debate negotiations. Well, maybe candidate X will agree to this particular station because it's owned by this company as opposed to another. I think that's one thing we all need to be sort of mindful and watchful about, because given the crucial importance of local news, we don't want to get into a situation, particularly at this level, where viewers are picking and choosing what station they're watching because they believe one is more aligned with their particular political perspective or another. So just a trend I think we need to be mindful of going forward.
Fine. All right, then I'll ask one final question, and we'll start with Mr. Tolbert, if that's okay. I think a period of 4 years can change a lot. We're in a midterm right now. We've got 2 more years before the 2024 presidential election. What are the next 2 years going to look like in the media world?
About the same as it does now.
You think?
If I'm wrong, I don't know anybody here who's got a predictor, but I don't see anything that indicates there's going to be any change. We're too entrenched. There's too many people picking sides, and they're not going to move over. So I don't think it's going to change one iota.
What do you think local media, what would you like to see local media representatives focusing on, local media outlets?
This is not the answer to that question. I'm going to pivot. But, just sitting here thinking, the media has such an important, powerful role to play in the community's life. And you don't have to go back any further than the sale of the JEA, the attempted sale of the JEA. It was the media who basically stopped that. Not by themselves, they had some help. But it was those guys at the Times Union, Chris and Nate, and it was the folks in the broadcast media. It happens. It doesn't happen often, and thank God maybe we don't need it to happen that often, but they still have the power. I don't know that they know exactly how and when to use it.
Chris, the evolving election narrative, what do the next couple of years look like?
I think more and more competition in the media space. I mean, just think about the new social media platforms that have just come online. A couple of years ago, not many people had heard of TikTok, and that is now kind of a major way that even candidates and governments are beginning to engage in this space. So I think, if change is the law of life, as they say, I think that we're going to continue to see the proliferation of those direct kind of messaging platforms that exist out there, and just going to be incumbent on traditional media to continue to find ways to evolve itself to maintain that relevance in that ever-changing space with more and more direct messaging opportunities.
Thank you.
That's what I meant. Not going to change, Chris. Is I don't see the tone.
Right.
I don't see the tone getting any better.
The tone of politics should be, yeah.
Yes, sir. Steve, you? The ever-evolving election narrative.
I have hope in a couple of areas. One is, I think people are increasingly annoyed at the tone, at the attack ads. And if the mainstream media can stop playing the politicians' games and cover what's behind it, what's underneath it, what we need in our communities, and hold the politicians accountable for answering the questions that the public really wants answered, that could certainly help. And I think there's a trend, and I'm aware of it, and some of the others in the room are probably aware of it, for some nonprofit news organizations to exist. I mean, JCT is kind of modeling that in our community, and if you paid attention, their level of commitment to news has like quadrupled in the last 4 years. So if that keeps happening, And there's other nonprofit news organizations that aren't driven by, getting the largest audience or having to have 20 different stories in 30-minute newscasts so that everybody in a mass audience gets something that they're interested in. That's what got us here. And if we can start focusing on issues and substance and show people that that's important, maybe enough people will pay attention that it'll change.
Great feedback. Thank you all for your feedback and for your guidance today. I can't end a panel or an interview without saying, is there anything else that you would like to add? No. Okay, great. Please, a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you for being with us. And we'll turn it back over to Ken. Anything else for the group, sir?
No, just I think it was a very valid and in-depth discussion, much like we want to have for these. So I appreciate everybody coming out. So far, I've only had one nomination of a former president becoming the vice president again, Mr. Ray. I'm not sure he was aware of that. But if you're interested, I put paper out, put it down, we'll get in contact with you. Unless you want to be elected right now. Nobody wants to be, okay. So help us spread the word about the organization, what we do, and the board members would appreciate some help getting their replacements so they can officially leave the board. All right, thanks for coming out, guys. I appreciate it.